They weren't emotionless. They were trained to disappear inside themselves. Why did an entire generation learn to stay quiet about pain? What happens when feelings are treated like weaknesses instead of signals? The answer isn't simple, but it shaped how they love, trust, and survive. Growing up in the 1970s created a very specific emotional environment that many people still carry inside them today. It wasn't always spoken, but it was deeply felt and consistently reinforced through everyday life. This video explores why so many children of that era learned to hide their feelings and how those patterns quietly shaped their identity, relationships, and sense of self long into adulthood. Many believe that children from that time were simply tougher, naturally resilient, or emotionally stronger than today's generation. That assumption sounds flattering, but it hides a more complicated and uncomfortable truth beneath the surface. What looked like strength was often emotional suppression. What seemed like independence was frequently learned silence. And what appeared as resilience was sometimes just the absence of safe spaces to express vulnerability. Imagine a child falling down hard while playing outside, scraping their knee and holding back tears. Instead of comfort, they hear, "Stop crying, you're fine," and something inside them quietly shifts. That moment may seem small, almost insignificant, but repeated thousands of times, it builds a pattern. The child begins to associate emotional expression with rejection, dismissal, or even subtle shame. Picture dinner tables where conversations revolved around survival, work, and discipline, but rarely feelings. Emotions weren't discussed. They were managed internally, often without guidance or understanding. Homes were structured around authority, not emotional openness. Parents were providers first, emotional companions second, if at all. Love was present, but it wasn't always expressed in ways children could recognize or feel. In schools, discipline and conformity were emphasized over emotional awareness. Children learned quickly that fitting in meant staying quiet, following rules, and not drawing attention to internal struggles. This environment created a silent agreement. Feelings were private, sometimes inconvenient, and often something to get over rather than explore or understand deeply. Psychologically, this is known as emotional conditioning. When a behavior, like expressing sadness, is consistently met with discouragement, the brain learns to avoid it to reduce discomfort or rejection. Over time, this avoidance becomes automatic. The child doesn't consciously decide to hide their feelings. It becomes a reflex, a protective mechanism designed to maintain acceptance and stability. Another concept at play is emotional minimization. When a child's feelings are repeatedly dismissed, they begin to believe those feelings are not important or valid enough to be shared. This doesn't erase emotions, it only buries them. The feelings remain, but they become harder to access, understand, and communicate as the child grows older. Interestingly, this environment also built certain strengths. Children learned to solve problems independently because emotional support was not always available or encouraged. They developed a high tolerance for discomfort, both physical and emotional. Sitting with unease became normal, not something that required immediate resolution or external validation. Responsibility came early. Many children were expected to manage tasks, care for siblings, or navigate situations without constant adult supervision, reinforcing a sense of self-reliance. This independence created capable adults, people who could function under pressure and handle challenges without falling apart. But it also came with a hidden cost. When you learn to rely only on yourself, asking for help can feel unnatural or even threatening. Vulnerability becomes unfamiliar territory rather than a safe connection point. Daily routines reinforced this mindset. Children spent long hours outside, navigating social dynamics, solving conflicts, and entertaining themselves without adult intervention. If a disagreement happened, they worked it out or walked away. There were no immediate mediators, no structured emotional guidance, just real-time trial and error. This built social awareness, but also taught them to suppress emotional reactions in order to maintain group acceptance and avoid conflict escalation. Boredom played a surprisingly important role. Without constant entertainment, children were forced to sit with their thoughts, create their own fun, and develop internal worlds. That space encouraged creativity, but it also meant they processed emotions alone, without language or support to fully understand what they were feeling. Contrast this with today's environment, where emotions are more openly discussed and validated, and the difference becomes clear. One generation internalized, another is encouraged to externalize. Neither approach is perfect, but the 1970s model leaned heavily toward emotional restraint, often at the expense of self-expression and emotional clarity. Over time, this restraint became identity. People began to see themselves as not emotional or just private, without realizing those traits were learned adaptations rather than inherent qualities. In relationships, this can create distance. When someone has spent decades hiding their feelings, expressing them can feel uncomfortable, even unsafe, despite wanting deeper connection. It's not that they don't feel deeply. In many cases, they feel intensely, but lack the tools or permission they were never given to express those emotions openly. This can lead to misunderstandings. Others may perceive them as cold or detached, when in reality, they are simply operating within patterns formed early in life. The workplace often rewarded these traits. Being composed, controlled, and emotionally reserved was seen as professionalism, reinforcing the belief that hiding feelings was the correct approach. Praise for being strong or tough further cemented the behavior. It created a feedback loop where emotional suppression was not only normalized, but admired. Yet beneath that surface, many carried unresolved emotions, stress, and experiences that were never fully processed or expressed in a healthy way. This doesn't mean their upbringing was wrong. It means it was shaped by the realities, expectations, and cultural norms of that specific time period. Understanding this context is important because it shifts the narrative from judgment to awareness. It helps explain behaviors that might otherwise seem confusing or distant. When you realize someone learned to hide their feelings as a survival strategy, their silence starts to make more sense. It becomes less about unwillingness and more about conditioning. This awareness also opens the door for change. Patterns that were learned can be unlearned, but only when they are first recognized and understood. The same discipline that helped them endure can also help them grow. The same independence that kept them stable can support emotional exploration when they choose to engage with it. There is a quiet strength in people who learn to navigate life without constant emotional validation. But there is also a quiet weight they've been carrying for years. Acknowledging both sides is essential. It honors their resilience without ignoring the emotional cost that came with it. As we continue, the deeper layers begin to unfold. The silence wasn't just about culture or parenting styles, it was also about how they experienced risk, solitude, and personal growth. And those experiences shaped far more than just how they expressed feelings. They influenced how they think, act, connect, and respond to the world around them. The story doesn't end with suppression. It evolves into something more complex, where hidden emotions quietly shape decisions, relationships, and identity in ways that often go unnoticed. To truly understand this generation, you have to look beyond what they show and into what they were taught not to reveal. Because sometimes, the strongest people you meet are the ones who were never given the chance to be emotionally seen. And that changes everything about how they move through life, even decades later. Risk was not theoretical for them. It was something they physically encountered. Climbing high walls, jumping across rooftops, or riding fast without protection taught them consequences through experience rather than explanation. Pain wasn't always prevented. It was endured, processed internally, and often dismissed quickly. This created a direct relationship with reality, where mistakes weren't analyzed emotionally, but absorbed as silent lessons. Through these repeated experiences, They developed a practical understanding of cause and effect. Actions had consequences, and those consequences were rarely softened by emotional reassurance or prolonged discussion. This approach strengthened decision-making under pressure. When you've faced real consequences without emotional cushioning, hesitation decreases and action becomes more instinctive, grounded in lived experience rather than overthinking. But it also reinforced emotional isolation. When you handle pain alone repeatedly, you begin to believe that sharing it is unnecessary or even inappropriate, further deepening the habit of emotional concealment. Solitude became a familiar companion. Long hours spent alone, walking, thinking, or simply existing without constant stimulation created an internal world that was both rich and private. In that quiet space, they learned to reflect, even if they didn't always have the language to describe what they discovered. Thoughts became conversations they had only with themselves. This kind of introspection built clarity in some ways. It allowed them to observe patterns, understand behaviors, and develop personal philosophies without external influence or validation. Yet, it also meant that many emotional experiences were processed without guidance. Misinterpretations could go unchallenged, and feelings could become tangled without resolution or external perspective. Over time, this created emotionally independent individuals. They didn't rely on others to regulate their feelings because they were never taught to. Instead, they learned to manage everything internally. Emotional intelligence, in this context, looked different. It wasn't about openly expressing feelings, but about controlling them, delaying reactions, and maintaining composure regardless of internal intensity. They became skilled at reading environments and adjusting behavior accordingly. Subtle cues, tone changes, and social dynamics were carefully observed to avoid conflict or unnecessary attention. This awareness often made them perceptive in social settings. They could sense tension, anticipate reactions, and navigate conversations with caution and precision. However, expressing their own emotions remained difficult. Knowing how others feel does not automatically translate into knowing how to communicate personal feelings effectively. Delayed reactions became normal. Instead of responding emotionally in the moment, they processed experiences privately, sometimes hours or days later when it felt safer to engage internally. This delay created a sense of control, but it also distanced them from immediate emotional experiences. Feelings were often understood intellectually rather than fully expressed or released. Patience was another trait shaped by their environment. Rewards were not immediate, and gratification often required waiting, effort, or persistence over time. Saving money, working toward goals, or simply waiting for opportunities taught them that progress was gradual, not instant. This mindset influenced how they approached life decisions. Unlike modern expectations of quick results, they became comfortable with slow growth. They understood that meaningful outcomes often required consistency rather than urgency. This ability to delay gratification translated into discipline. They could stay committed to long-term goals without needing constant validation or immediate success to stay motivated. But again, this came with a trade-off. When you learn to wait for everything, including emotional resolution, you may postpone addressing feelings that need attention in the present. Failure was not treated as identity. It was simply part of the process. If something didn't work, you tried again without overanalyzing what it meant about you as a person. This perspective built resilience. Setbacks didn't define them. They were expected. Life was understood as unpredictable, requiring adaptation rather than emotional collapse. However, because failure wasn't deeply discussed, the emotional impact of it was often internalized. Disappointment was felt, but rarely processed openly or shared. They learned to move forward quickly, sometimes without fully understanding what they had experienced. This kept them functional, but occasionally left unresolved emotional layers beneath the surface. Social interactions were direct and unfiltered. Without digital communication, conversations happened face-to-face, requiring attention to tone, body language, and immediate feedback. This sharpened their ability to read people. They became attuned to subtle shifts in behavior, understanding meaning beyond words through observation and experience. Conflict was handled in real time. Arguments weren't paused or edited, they unfolded naturally, teaching negotiation, compromise, and sometimes restraint through direct engagement. These experiences built strong social instincts. They understood group dynamics, loyalty, and boundaries without needing structured lessons on communication or emotional awareness. Yet, even in social settings, emotional expression remained limited. You could joke, argue, or interact, but deep vulnerability was still often kept hidden beneath the surface. In today's world, where emotional openness is encouraged, this contrast becomes more visible. What once was considered normal behavior can now seem distant or emotionally unavailable. But these traits are not flaws, they are adaptations. They were shaped by a time that prioritized survival, discipline, and stability over emotional exploration. Understanding this helps bridge the gap between generations. It allows people to see beyond behavior and recognize the experiences that created it. There is value in both worlds. The emotional awareness of today and the resilience of the past can complement each other when understood rather than judged. For those who grew up hiding their feelings, change is possible, but it requires intention. It starts with recognizing that emotional expression is not weakness, but a different kind of strength. It means learning new skills, like naming emotions, sharing them gradually, and allowing vulnerability to exist without fear of rejection or dismissal. This process can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges patterns that have been in place for decades. But discomfort is often the first step toward growth. At the same time, their existing strengths should not be overlooked. Their patience, discipline, and independence are powerful tools that can support emotional development. When these qualities are combined with emotional awareness, they create a balanced approach to life, where strength and vulnerability coexist rather than compete. The goal is not to become someone else, but to expand what already exists, to add emotional expression to resilience, not replace it. Because hiding feelings may have once been necessary, but it doesn't always have to be permanent. And perhaps the most powerful realization is this: the things they were taught to suppress are often the very things that can bring them closer to others. Connection begins where silence ends. And even after years of hiding, that door is never completely closed. It only takes a moment of honesty, a willingness to feel, and the courage to share what was once kept inside. That is how patterns shift, not overnight, but gradually, through awareness, intention, and small acts of emotional truth. And in that process, a generation that learned to hide can slowly learn something new: how to be seen,